The autumn rain hammered against the wooden shutters of the farmhouse in the Belgian countryside, each drop a reminder that winter was approaching, and with it, the growing shadow of war. It was October 1944, and the war that had begun 5 years earlier showed no signs of ending soon. In this small farming community near the Ardennes forest, life had become a delicate balance between survival and resistance, between appearing compliant to the occupying forces while secretly undermining them at every opportunity. This is the story of how one man's desperate ingenuity in a modified farming tractor became an unlikely weapon that changed the course of a crucial battle, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage come from the most ordinary people. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more amazing historical stories like this one. Marcel Dubois was 52 years old, a third-generation farmer who had inherited his family's 140 acres of land in the Belgian countryside. His hands were calloused from decades of working the soil, his face weathered by sun and wind, and his back bent slightly from years of manual labor. He was not a soldier, had never fired a weapon in anger, and had always believed that his contribution to the world would be measured in bushels of wheat and barrels of potatoes. But war has a way of forcing ordinary people to make extraordinary choices. Marcel had been born in this farmhouse in 1892, delivered by the same midwife who had brought his father into the world. He had grown up learning the rhythms of the land, understanding when to plant and when to harvest, how to read the weather and the clouds, and how to coax life from soil that had sustained his family for 3 generations. His father had taught him everything about farming, but had also taught him about dignity, about standing up for what was right, and about the responsibility that came with owning land that fed others. The Great War had touched Marcel's life when he was 22 years old. He had served in the Belgian army, spending 3 years in the trenches watching friends die in the mud. He had returned home in 1918 with a slight limp from shrapnel that had torn through his left calf, and with memories that still woke him in the night. He had married Claire 6 months after returning, desperate to build something beautiful in a world that had shown him so much ugliness. Their wedding had been simple, held in the small church in the village, with most of the guests still wearing patched clothes because new fabric was scarce. Their first son, Philippe, had been born in 1920, followed by Antoine 2 years later. Marcel had poured all his energy into the farm and into raising his boys. He taught them everything his father had taught him: the proper way to plow a field, how to maintain equipment so it would last for decades, the importance of respecting the land that provided for them. Philippe had his mother's gentle nature and his father's work ethic, while Antoine was more adventurous, always asking questions about the world beyond their farm. The farm had prospered during the 1920s and early 30s. Marcel had modernized slowly and carefully, purchasing the International Harvester Farmall tractor in 1938 after saving for nearly 5 years. It had been a significant investment, but the machine allowed him to work his fields more efficiently and to help neighboring farms during harvest season. The tractor became almost like a member of the family, reliable and essential to their livelihood. When war came again in 1940, Marcel had felt a deep sense of despair. He was 48 years old, and the world was once again tearing itself apart. The German invasion of Belgium had been swift and brutal. He had watched from his hillside as military convoys rolled through the valley below, an endless stream of men and machines heading west toward France. The occupation that followed was harsh and methodical. The Germans took what they wanted, and any resistance was met with immediate and severe punishment. The German occupation had been brutal on the farming communities. The Wehrmacht requisitioned most of the harvest, leaving barely enough for the farmers to survive through the winter. Marcel's 2 sons had both been taken for forced labor in Germany 18 months earlier, and he had heard nothing from them since. His wife, Claire, kept their photographs on the mantel, praying every night for their safe return. The farmhouse that had once been filled with laughter and the sounds of children now echoed with a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the old clock in the kitchen. The day the Germans came for his sons was burned into Marcel's memory with painful clarity. It had been a cold morning in April 1943. A military truck had arrived at dawn, and a young German officer, barely older than Philippe, had knocked on the door with a list of names. Philippe was 23, and Antoine was 21, both strong and healthy, exactly what the Reich needed for its labor force. Marcel had tried to argue, explaining that without his sons he couldn't maintain the farm that fed the local community, but the officer had been unmoved. He had his orders. Claire had packed small bags for each of them, including photographs, a change of clothes, and what little food she could spare. She had hugged both boys tightly, whispering prayers and making them promise to stay together and look out for each other. Philippe had been stoic, trying to be brave for his mother, while Antoine had tears streaming down his face. Marcel had shaken their hands, unable to trust his voice to say goodbye. As the truck drove away, he had stood in the road watching until it disappeared from sight, his fists clenched so tightly his nails drew blood from his palms. The months that followed had been the darkest of Marcel's life. Every night, Claire would sit by the window with her rosary praying for their son's safety. Every morning, Marcel would wake, hoping for a letter that never came. The Red Cross had no information. Inquiries through official channels went unanswered. They existed in a terrible limbo, not knowing if their boys were alive or dead, suffering or merely surviving. The farm work became both a burden and a blessing. It was harder without his sons, the long days of physical labor nearly breaking his aging body. But it also gave him something to focus on, something to do besides worry and wait. He threw himself into the work with almost manic intensity, maintaining every piece of equipment with obsessive care, working the fields until his hands bled and his back screamed in protest. Neighbors would sometimes find him in his barn late at night, doing maintenance on the tractor by lamplight, unable to sleep with his mind full of dark thoughts. Marcel's farm sat at a strategic location, perched on a hillside overlooking a narrow valley that served as one of the few passable routes through the dense Ardennes forest. The main road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, wound through his property before descending into the valley below. For most of his life, this location had been a blessing, giving him fertile soil and beautiful views. Now, as Allied forces pushed eastward following the D-Day invasion, that same location had become a potential battlefield. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Marcel rose before dawn, as he had done every day for 4 decades, and went out to tend to what remained of his livestock. The Germans had taken most of his cattle, leaving him with just 3 dairy cows and a handful of chickens. But they had left him his most prized possession, his 1938 International Harvester Farmall tractor. They had left it because it was old, temperamental, and the fuel it required was in such short supply that even the occupying forces couldn't spare it. Marcel had kept the machine running through a combination of mechanical ingenuity and sheer stubbornness, scrounging parts from abandoned equipment and mixing whatever fuel he could obtain. That morning, as he walked past the tractor in his barn, he noticed something unusual. Hidden beneath a pile of hay in the far corner was a young man, barely 20 years old, wearing the tattered remains of an American Army uniform. The soldier's left arm was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, blood seeping through the dirty cloth. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much death. Marcel quickly closed the barn door and knelt beside the wounded soldier. In broken English, learned from a schoolteacher decades earlier, he asked what had happened. The young American, whose name was Private James Crawford from Ohio, explained that his reconnaissance unit had been ambushed 3 days earlier while scouting the area. He was the only survivor. He had been moving from farm to farm, hiding during the day and traveling at night, trying to make his way back to Allied lines. Marcel's mind raced through the implications of what he had found. The Germans had posted notices throughout the region warning that anyone caught harboring Allied soldiers would be executed immediately, and that their families would be sent to labor camps. Just 3 weeks earlier, a farmer 2 villages over had been hanged in the town square for hiding a downed British pilot. His wife and daughter had been dragged away to Germany, and no one had heard from them since. The message was clear and brutal. But as Marcel looked at this wounded American boy, shivering with fever and fear, he saw his own sons. He thought about Philippe and Antoine, somewhere in Germany, and wondered if someone had shown them kindness, if someone had risked their own life to help them when they needed it. He thought about the values his father had instilled in him, about the difference between existing and living, between survival and maintaining one's humanity. Marcel knew the risk he was taking. Harboring an Allied soldier meant execution not just for him, but potentially for Claire and any neighbors the Germans suspected of helping. But looking at this wounded boy, who could have been his own son, Marcel made his choice. He brought the soldier into the farmhouse, where Claire immediately set about cleaning and bandaging his wound properly. They hid him in a concealed space beneath the floorboards that Marcel had constructed months earlier, anticipating that such a hiding place might one day be necessary. The hiding space was cramped and dark, barely large enough for a man to lie down. Marcel had built it by removing several floorboards in the pantry and excavating the earth beneath, creating a small chamber lined with wood to prevent collapse. A person could access it by lifting a section of the floor that appeared to be nailed down but was actually held in place by hidden latches. Once someone was inside and the floor was replaced, the hiding spot was virtually undetectable. Marcel had never expected to actually use it, but the paranoia of living under occupation had driven him to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Claire worked on Private Crawford's wound with the efficiency of someone who had tended to injuries all her life. Farm life meant dealing with accidents regularly, and she had become skilled at cleaning wounds, setting broken bones, and determining when an injury needed more professional care than she could provide. The bullet had passed through the soldier's upper arm without hitting bone or major blood vessels, a lucky wound if such a thing could be said to exist. The main danger was infection, and Claire applied a poultice made from herbs she had grown in her garden, a recipe passed down from her grandmother that had antimicrobial properties, even if she didn't know the scientific explanation. Over the next 2 days, Private Crawford recovered some of his strength. In whispered conversations, he told Marcel about what he had observed during his reconnaissance mission. A large German armored column, including at least 12 Panzer tanks and numerous support vehicles, was preparing to move through this very valley. Intelligence suggested they were being repositioned to counter an expected Allied offensive. The Germans were using this route specifically because they believed it was too narrow and rural to be properly defended or monitored by Allied forces. Marcel understood immediately what this meant. If that column moved through unopposed, it could strike at the vulnerable flank of the Allied advance. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of soldiers could die. He had no radio, no way to contact the Allies, and even if he could get word out, there wasn't enough time for them to reposition forces to block the valley. The column was expected to move through in just 2 days. That night, Marcel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to Claire's breathing beside him, thinking about his sons somewhere in Germany, about the young American hidden beneath his floorboards, about all the sons and fathers who would die if he did nothing. He thought about the tractor sitting in his barn, about the narrow road, about the steep hillside that formed the eastern wall of the valley, and slowly, impossibly, a plan began to form. Marcel had spent his entire life studying the land around his farm. He knew every hill, every stream, every rock formation. He understood soil composition in a way that only comes from decades of working with it. He knew which areas held water and became unstable after rain, which slopes were prone to erosion, where the bedrock was close to the surface and where deep soil made the ground treacherous. This knowledge, accumulated over 5 decades of farming, was about to become a weapon. The next morning, Marcel walked through his property with new eyes. The road passed directly below a section of hillside that was particularly steep, almost a cliff face in places. Years of farming had taught him to read the land, to understand how water flowed, how soil shifted, how weight and pressure could transform stable ground into a mudslide. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before, the way rainwater had eroded channels in the hillside, the large rocks embedded in the slope, the old trees with shallow root systems barely holding the soil in place. The geology of the hillside was complex. The upper layer was a mixture of clay and loam, about 6 feet deep in most places, sitting on top of a layer of weathered limestone. Water had been seeping between these layers for years, creating a natural slip plane. Several large boulders, some weighing several tons, were embedded in this upper layer, held in place primarily by tree roots and soil cohesion. If that cohesion could be broken, if the slope could be destabilized at the right point, the entire section could slide downward like a slow avalanche. Marcel had seen it happen once before, during a particularly wet spring 15 years earlier. A section of hillside about half a mile from his farm had simply slumped downward after weeks of rain, covering a small section of road with debris. It had taken workers 3 days to clear it. He remembered standing there watching them work, marveling at how much earth had moved, how the landscape had been permanently altered by natural forces. Now he was contemplating deliberately triggering that same kind of event. He went to his barn and looked at his tractor with fresh perspective. The farmall was a beast of a machine, weighing nearly 4,000 pounds. It had a steel frame, a powerful engine that, when properly tuned, could generate significant torque, and most importantly, it had heavy iron weights bolted to its front end to improve traction when pulling heavy loads. An idea that seemed insane began to take shape in his mind. Marcel spent that entire day working with a feverish intensity. He used chains and rope to attach every heavy object he could find to the tractor, additional weights, old plowshares, pieces of scrap iron. He fashioned a crude blade from sheet metal and wood beams, attaching it to the front of the tractor like a makeshift bulldozer. To anyone watching, it might have looked like he was preparing the tractor for some heavy farm work, but Marcel had something very different in mind. The modifications were crude but effective. He welded additional steel plates to the front of the tractor, creating a wedge shape that would dig into the soil rather than riding over it. He added extra ballast by filling old ammunition cans with concrete and chaining them to the frame. He adjusted the front-end loader arms to create a scooping effect. The tractor, which normally weighed 4,000 pounds, now tipped the scales at nearly 6,000 pounds. It looked like some kind of agricultural monster, barely recognizable as the farming implement it had been. Private Crawford, watching from the farmhouse window, understood what Marcel was planning. He tried to convince the farmer to flee instead, to take Claire and run before the Germans arrived. But Marcel shook his head. This was his land, his home. More importantly, this was something he could do, perhaps the only thing he could do to strike back against the occupation that had taken his sons, his harvest, his freedom. That evening, Marcel drove the heavily modified tractor up the hillside to a position directly above the road. The machine groaned under the additional weight, but the old engine kept running. He positioned it carefully, calculating angles and distances with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life understanding how machinery and landscape interacted. He cut several of the trees that were holding the hillside in place, weakening the slope's stability. Then he drove the tractor back down and waited. The German column arrived just after dawn on October 18th. Marcel heard them long before he saw them, the distinctive rumble of tank engines echoing through the valley. He had sent Claire to stay with neighbors 3 miles away, telling her only that she needed to be gone for the day. She had kissed him goodbye, her eyes full of unspoken questions and fears, but she'd gone without argument. They had been married 30 years, and she knew when her husband had made up his mind about something. Marcel climbed into his tractor and started the engine. The old machine coughed and sputtered before settling into its familiar rhythm. Private Crawford, against Marcel's wishes, had insisted on helping. The young soldier couldn't use his injured arm, but he could watch and warn if German soldiers approached. Together, they waited as the column entered the valley. Through his binoculars, Marcel counted the vehicles. 12 Panzer tanks, exactly as Crawford had reported, along with half-tracks carrying infantry, supply trucks, and command vehicles. It was an impressive display of military might, tons of steel and firepower moving in a coordinated column along the narrow road. They moved with the confidence of an unstoppable force, which was exactly what made them vulnerable. Marcel waited until the lead tanks had passed beneath his position, and the main body of the column was directly below him. His hands gripped the tractor's steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. Every instinct told him to flee, to hide, to survive. But he thought of his sons, and he put the tractor into gear. The Farmall lurched forward, its engine roaring as Marcel pushed it to maximum throttle. The heavily weighted machine crashed through the remaining trees at the hillside's edge and began to slide down the steep slope. Marcel had angled it perfectly, using the tractor itself as a massive projectile aimed at the weakest point of the hillside. The weight of the machine, combined with the momentum of its descent, was tremendous. The sensation was unlike anything Marcel had ever experienced. The tractor accelerated down the slope, bouncing over rocks and small trees, the engine screaming in protest. Marcel gripped the steering wheel with both hands, fighting to keep the machine pointed toward the target zone he had identified. The wind whipped past his face, dirt and debris flying up from the tractor's path. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. He could see the German column below, could see soldiers looking up in confusion at the noise, could see the exact spot where he needed to hit. At the last possible moment, Marcel released his grip and threw himself sideways off the tractor. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, and immediately began to roll and tumble down the hillside. Rocks and branches tore at his clothes and skin. He covered his head with his arms, trying to protect himself from the worst impacts. He could hear the tractor continuing its descent, could hear the tremendous crash as it slammed into the hillside's critical point. The tractor slammed into the hillside with devastating effect. The impact triggered exactly what Marcel had engineered, a massive landslide. Tons of soil, rocks, and debris began cascading down the slope toward the road below. Marcel jumped from the tractor at the last second, rolling down the hillside and coming to rest against a boulder that probably saved his life. The landslide started as a rumble. A deep sound felt more than heard, as if the earth itself was groaning. Then the hillside began to move. The upper layer of soil, already saturated from recent rains and weakened by Marcel's preparatory cuts to the tree roots, lost its cohesion. It began to slide downward, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The movement propagated outward from the impact point, destabilizing adjacent sections of the slope. Large boulders, freed from the soil matrix that had held them in place, began to tumble downward, gaining momentum and dislodging more material as they went. The sound was incredible, a roar like thunder mixed with the grinding of stone on stone. Dust and debris filled the air, creating a brown cloud that obscured visibility. Trees snapped like matchsticks as the moving earth overwhelmed them. The carefully engineered agricultural landscape was transforming into a chaotic natural disaster, and it was all aimed directly at the German column below. The landslide hit the German column like an avalanche. The narrow road, with nowhere for the vehicles to maneuver, became a trap. The lead Panzer managed to accelerate and escape, and two at the rear reversed in time to avoid the worst of it, but the remaining 9 tanks were caught directly in the path of the debris. Tons of earth and rock poured over the road, burying vehicles, blocking passage completely and creating chaos throughout the column. The first tank to be hit was struck by a boulder the size of a small car. The massive rock crashed down onto the turret with tremendous force, buckling the armor and jamming the mechanism. The crew inside had only seconds of warning before impact, not enough time to do anything but brace for the collision. The tank lurched sideways from the impact, its tracks losing purchase on the road surface, now covered in loose soil. The second and third tanks in line fared even worse. The full weight of the landslide, thousands of tons of earth and stone cascaded directly onto them. Within seconds, they were partially buried, soil pouring through open hatches and vision slits. Crews scrambled to close hatches, but the speed of the slide made it impossible. The tanks, designed to withstand direct hits from artillery shells, were helpless against the overwhelming force of the moving earth. Behind the tanks, the half-tracks and supply trucks were scattered like toys. Several vehicles were pushed completely off the road by the force of the slide, tumbling down the opposite embankment. One truck, loaded with ammunition, was struck by debris and caught fire, the flames adding to the chaos and confusion. Soldiers who had been riding in the open vehicles jumped clear, running in all directions to escape the avalanche of earth bearing down on them. But Marcel's plan was even more effective than he had dared hope. The landslide didn't just block the road, it fundamentally altered the terrain. The massive amount of displaced earth changed the elevation and stability of the entire valley floor. Several tanks found themselves partially buried, their tracks unable to gain traction in the loose soil. Others were blocked by massive boulders that had been dislodged from the hillside. The column, which had been a coordinated military force, was now a scattered collection of isolated vehicles unable to support each other. The debris field stretched for nearly 200 meters along the road. In some places, the accumulated earth was 10 feet deep, completely burying sections of the road. Large boulders, some weighing multiple tons, were scattered throughout the debris, creating obstacles that no vehicle could navigate around. The careful engineering that had gone into building the road through this valley had been undone in less than 5 minutes by one farmer's desperate action. German soldiers poured from the half-tracks, shouting orders and trying to assess the situation. Officers screamed into radios, calling for engineering equipment and reinforcements. But the damage was done. The column was trapped, stuck in a narrow valley with no way forward and limited ability to retreat. The immediate aftermath was pandemonium. German officers tried to establish order among troops who were shocked and disoriented by the sudden attack. Some soldiers thought they were under artillery fire and took cover, scanning the surrounding hills for enemy positions. Others began the futile task of trying to dig out the buried vehicles by hand. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, surveying the devastation and trying to radio for instructions from higher command. The German engineering units that arrived 2 hours later could do little to help. They had equipment designed to build bridges and clear obstacles, but nothing adequate for moving thousands of tons of earth and rock. The senior engineer, a captain who had built roads across Poland and Russia, took one look at the situation and shook his head. Clearing this would take weeks, not days, and they would need heavy equipment that simply wasn't available in the region. Meanwhile, the trapped tanks were sitting targets. Their armor, designed to protect them from direct fire, couldn't protect them from the vulnerability of immobility. Tank crews knew from bitter experience that a stationary tank was a dead tank. They began the laborious process of trying to free their vehicles, but the loose soil defied their efforts. Tracks spun uselessly, digging the tanks deeper into the debris rather than pulling them free. Marcel, bruised and battered from his roll down the hillside, managed to crawl into the forest before German soldiers reached his position. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, and he could feel warm blood running down his face from a gash above his right eye. His left shoulder throbbed where it had impacted a rock, and he suspected several ribs were cracked. But he was alive, and more importantly, he had succeeded. Private Crawford had already fled deeper into the woods, as they had planned. They met at a predetermined location 2 miles away, a small cave that local hunters had used for generations. Marcel knew about this cave from his childhood, had played in it as a boy, and had later used it as a shelter during storms when working the far corners of his property. It was well hidden, concealed by thick brush, and known only to locals who had grown up in the area. Crawford helped Marcel into the cave, his own injury making the task difficult but not impossible. The young American had found a spring nearby and brought water in his helmet, using it to clean Marcel's wounds as best he could. They sat in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of chaos from the valley below, each man dealing with what had just happened in his own way. For Marcel, the reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in. He had destroyed his tractor, the machine that had been central to his livelihood for 6 years. He had likely made his farm a target for German reprisal. He might have killed German soldiers, something he had hoped never to do again after the horrors of the Great War. But he had also potentially saved countless Allied lives, had struck a real blow against the occupation that had stolen his sons and his freedom. Crawford, for his part, was in awe of what the farmer had accomplished. He had been part of reconnaissance units that had called in airstrikes and artillery barrages, had seen the destructive power of modern military technology, but he had never witnessed anything like what Marcel had achieved with nothing but an old tractor and intimate knowledge of the land. It was, he would later tell military intelligence officers, one of the most effective tactical strikes he had witnessed during the entire war. The effects of Marcel's desperate action became apparent over the following days. Allied reconnaissance planes spotted the stalled German column and called in artillery strikes. Unable to maneuver or effectively defend themselves, the trapped German forces suffered heavy casualties. The tanks that weren't destroyed were eventually abandoned as the crews realized they couldn't be extracted before Allied ground forces arrived. The German offensive that the column was meant to support never materialized, and the delay contributed to the Allied advance continuing with fewer casualties than it otherwise would have suffered. Marcel and Private Crawford remained hidden in the forest for 3 days before Allied forces reached the area. When they finally emerged, they were met by a company of British soldiers who were documenting the destroyed German column. The soldiers were astonished to learn that the massive landslide that had trapped the enemy forces had been engineered by a single farmer with a modified tractor. The British commander wanted to recommend Marcel for a medal, but Marcel refused any recognition. He had not acted for glory or commendation. He had acted because he was a father who had lost his sons to the war, because he was a farmer whose land had been stolen from him, because he was a man who had finally found a way to fight back against the occupation that had robbed him of everything he held dear. When Marcel finally returned to his farm, he found his house had been burned by retreating German soldiers who had suspected resistance activity in the area. Claire was safe with the neighbors, but the home they had built together over 3 decades was gone. Standing in the ashes, Marcel felt the weight of everything he had lost. But when he looked down into the valley and saw Allied soldiers moving freely through terrain that German tanks had intended to dominate, he felt something else too, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his actions had mattered. Private Crawford recovered from his wounds and returned to his unit. He survived the war and returned to Ohio, where he spent the rest of his life telling the story of the Belgian farmer who had stopped a German armored column with nothing but a tractor and incredible courage. He wrote letters to Marcel for years, maintaining a friendship forged in those desperate days. Marcel and Claire rebuilt their farmhouse, though it was never quite the same. 6 months after the war ended, they received word that both of their sons were alive, liberated from a labor camp in Germany. The reunion was emotional beyond words, a family shattered by war pieced back together. Marcel continued farming his land until he was too old to work the fields himself. The old farm tractor, or what remained of it after its sacrificial plunge down the hillside, sat in a place of honor in his barn. He never repaired it, preferring to leave it as it was, a testament to the day when an ordinary farming machine became an instrument of resistance. The valley where the German column was trapped became known locally as Marcel's Valley, though no official maps bore that name. Visitors to the area can still see evidence of the landslide, the altered terrain a permanent reminder of what happened there. A small memorial was erected years later, not by any government, but by the local community, honoring the courage of ordinary people who resisted occupation in whatever ways they could. Marcel rarely spoke about what he had done. When asked, he would simply say that he was a farmer who used the tools he had available. He never considered himself a hero, just a father and a husband who had been pushed to the breaking point and had finally pushed back. But those who knew the full story understood that his actions represented something profound, the idea that even in the face of overwhelming military might, determination, ingenuity, and courage could still tip the balance. The story of Marcel Dubois and his modified tractor spread through military circles and eventually reached historians studying the war. It became a case study in asymmetric warfare and how civilians could contribute to military objectives without being soldiers. But more than that, it became a story about human resilience, about the refusal to be helpless in the face of oppression. Years later, a journalist asked Marcel if he had been afraid during those moments when he was driving the tractor toward the hillside, knowing that he might not survive what came next. Marcel thought for a long moment before answering. He said that fear was always there, but it was overshadowed by something stronger, the need to act, to do something, anything, rather than stand by and watch evil succeed. He said that his tractor, that old machine that had helped him feed his family and work his land, had one more harvest to bring in, and he was grateful that it had served him faithfully to the very end. Marcel Dubois passed away in 1973 at the age of 81, surrounded by his wife, his sons, and his grandchildren. Private James Crawford attended the funeral, traveling from Ohio to pay his respects to the man who had saved his life and changed the course of a battle with nothing but a farmer's ingenuity and an old tractor. During the eulogy, Crawford spoke about the lesson Marcel had taught him, that heroism isn't about having the biggest weapons or the most advanced technology. It's about having the courage to use whatever tools you have available when the moment demands action. The modified tractor that stopped 12 Panzer tanks dead in their tracks was never a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a farming implement, a tool designed to cultivate life from the soil. But in the hands of a desperate man who refused to remain passive, it became something more. It became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that the human spirit, when properly motivated, can find ways to overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. Today, fragments of that old Farmel tractor are preserved in a small museum in Belgium, alongside photographs of Marcel and testimonies from soldiers who witnessed the aftermath of that October morning in 1944. Visitors who stop to look at the rusted pieces of metal often ask the same question: how could something so simple have such a profound impact? The answer lies not in the machinery itself, but in the man who wielded it, a farmer who understood his land, who knew what his tools could do, and who had the courage to act when action was required. The story reminds us that in the darkest moments of history, when military forces clash and the outcome seems predetermined by whoever has the most tanks, the most planes, the most soldiers, there are still moments where individual action matters. Marcel Dubois didn't change the entire war, but he changed one battle, saved countless lives, and proved that even an ordinary man with an ordinary machine can accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demands it and courage provides the will. In the end, that modified tractor did exactly what Marcel had designed it to do. It transformed the landscape, created an obstacle that sophisticated military machinery couldn't overcome, and bought precious time for forces fighting for liberation. It was agricultural engineering turned into military strategy, civilian resourcefulness transformed into tactical advantage. And it all happened because one farmer refused to let the war simply roll over him and his land without resistance. The legacy of that day continues to inspire. Military academies study the incident as an example of terrain manipulation and asymmetric tactics. Historians cite it as evidence of how civilian resistance contributed to the Allied victory. But perhaps most importantly, it remains a story told in Belgian farmhouses, passed down through generations, about the day when ordinary courage changed the course of history, one old tractor at a time.